If you've clicked through to this video, you probably know that Scotland's great freedom fighter William Wallace was captured and taken to England for a show trial and brutal state murder. This memorial marks the spot where Wallace was captured by Sir John Menteith. But what if that had never happened? What if Wallace had escaped? What if he'd never come to this place? How might that have changed Scotland's story? If you're interested in the people, places and events in Scottish history, then click the subscribe button at the bottom right of the screen and ring the notification bell to be told when I upload new videos. In the meantime, let me introduce you to some experts. Today, I'm going to the King Robert Hotel next to the Bannockburn Heritage Centre to meet up with two eminent Scottish historians and wonderful people to ask them the question, what if Wallace had never been captured by John Menteith? Fiona Watson's an historian and writer specialising in the Anglo-Scottish Wars. Her new novel, Lies of the Flesh, set just after the Battle of Bannockburn, will be out in September 2024. Martain MacGregor is Senior Lecturer in Scottish History at Glasgow University, and he was part of the Robert Bruce Facial Depiction Project published in 2016. I'll leave links in the comments to both these wonderful people's work. Hello, Martin.
Bruce, good to see you.
Hi there, how you doing? And let me sit down. And we're here next to the Bannockburn Heritage Centre, the perfect place to talk about Scotland's wars of independence. Eh? And today I thought I'd ask you about, because everyone knows, because they've seen Braveheart, right, that William Wallace was captured by some treacherous guys and he went to be hung, drawn and quartered. And the guy who captured him was a guy called Menteith. And I wanted to ask today, what if he'd never been captured? How would that have changed the course of Scottish history? Now, to get us into that, let me ask you, what happened after William Wallace loses at the Battle of Falkirk? What was he doing after the Battle of Falkirk that got him to where he was when he was captured by Menteith?
Well, that's 1298's Falkirk, 1305 he's captured. So that's 7 years
That's
of somebody's
quite
life.
a lot of time.
That's
yeah.
a lot of time, and I suppose the first thing to say is we don't know a lot about what Wallace is up to in these years. You know, the sources are poor. One thing we do know, and it's a really interesting thing, is that he goes to the continent and then he goes to the court to Philip IV of France. So this is Wallace engaged in diplomatic service on behalf of the Scots, who were in this period continuing with this game plan of trying to get their king back on the throne, and they're looking to diplomatic support from France and the papacy to do that. So there's evidence that...
So the king is John Balliol.
The king is John Balliol, that's
Where
right.
is he at this point?
Well, initially Balliol is in the south, he's a prisoner of Edward's, but because the Scots are in this period very astute at playing the diplomatic game, in time Balliol is transferred to papal custody. Boniface VIII, who backs the Scots initially, and then he passes to the French, hands of the French, Philip IV.
Can I just check, is the papacy in Avignon at this point?
No,
is
the papacy's in Rome.
Right, okay.
Yep.
And how much later is the Avignon
Just
thing?
after this.
Just immediately after, right, okay.
Yeah.
Right, okay, sorry.
Yeah, so he comes, ultimately Balliol ends up in his own ancestral estates in northern France, in Picardy.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And in this period, William Wallace going to France is part of that, trying to gradually get...
But I think it's worth saying that Wallace is very much operating on his own. He's not part of the political setup in Scotland now. We know that because, well, first of all, the guardianship is taken over by John Comyn of Badenoch, Scotland's most important nobleman, and Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, the future king, who has succeeded in putting himself forward as an alternative political grouping, if you like, one very much based in his own head on the fact that he was robbed of the kingship back in 1292. And indeed, Robert Bruce, as Guardian, tries very hard not to say "in the name of King John." Whereas John Comyn makes him do that, because that is technically what he is. So leaving them aside, we know that Wallace goes to Stirling, where we are now, and harasses the supply line to the English garrison in the castle. And he's doing that while the others are doing other things. So he must have a loyal coterie of men, possibly Balliol men. We certainly know he goes to the continent with a number of Balliol men rather than John Comyn's men, because the Commons back Balliol. So he does that, and then a month or so later, this is the back end of 1299, he goes to the continent. And as Martain says, he visits the court of Philip IV, and we know that Philip gave him a gift of money, and he also lent him a large sum of money, which he was due to pay back.
Was he a good risk for a...
Well, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, the accounts of the French king, the point at which Wallace was to come back and pay it back, they're missing. So the big question, of course, is whether or not Wallace made it to Rome to see the Pope. Highly likely he did. We know that this was a source of much dispute, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, about this document that's now in the Public Record Office in London. It's not called that now, it's called the National Archives. They keep changing their names, they're always changing their names. So this document that was effectively a kind of safe conduct, saying that from the French king to the Pope, saying he was recommending, as a letter of recommendation of William Wallace. The English argue now that Wallace didn't have it on him when he was captured. We'll get to that later. That Wallace, when Wallace went to Rome, that he would have it on him. But no, this was Philip would have sent it on to Rome, and Wallace may or may not have arrived. I think he probably did have it on him, but we can't prove that. So Wallace he certainly did meet Balliol. We know that because he has a safe conduct from Balliol, and there's no other time that he could have got it. So he went to Picardy and met with John Balliol. So we know that too. But other than that, and we know that he comes back to Scotland in 1303.
So what's happening in Scotland when he's away doing that then?
Well, Edward, in the meantime, has finally, because of the fact that he's been able to make peace with France, because France has had a bad time of it with Flanders and the continent, that's kind of knocked France out the game. And these diplomatic levers, which the Scots have successfully played for a number of years, and which Wallace has been part of that initiative, they are no longer working for them in the same way. So Edward can now turn his undivided attention to Scotland, so we're kind of back there, that kind of Falkirk scenario, if you like. And Edward makes this good, and he effectively achieves a second conquest of Scotland in 1304. So in the wake of that, you've really got the Scottish political community effectively coming over, just accepting that situation, accepting that situation, and there's going to be now an English regime coming in again. But Wallace, typical of the man, of course, he remains outside of that, and is irreconcilable to Edward's regime, and therefore is public enemy number one, you could say, as far as Edward is concerned. So the question of his capture is a matter of priority for Edward.
What I find fascinating, though, is that when Wallace comes back from the continent in 1303, he just joins the Scottish army as one of the commanders under John Comyn, who is the sole guardian by this time. And in fact, even English sources give him his Sir. They call him Sir William Wallace, which they rarely do. And then, as Martain says, what happens is that the Scots target the southwest of Scotland, because Edward, for the first time, is crossing the Forth and going up into northeast Scotland. So they target English garrisons down there, and it's just a sensible strategy because of course, after Falkirk, what John Comyn in particular does is not fight battles. John Comyn is actually the first to adopt guerrilla tactics in a much more systematic way, and he doesn't get any credit for that, of course, because Robert Bruce steals that thunder. So John Comyn has been reasonably successful in that respect, but Edward has been moving more garrisons out to the west, moving slightly further north to the Forth, the line of the Forth, and then in 1303 he crosses the Forth. And John Comyn as guardian, given the diplomatic isolation of the Scots, given that the French king and the Pope want to be friends with Edward I for their different reasons, that John Comyn thinks, okay, I think now after all these years of war, probably we should negotiate a peace, and that's exactly what happens. Now, Wallace is, in the negotiations that go on at the beginning of 1304, there's a couple of people whom Edward regards as beyond the pale. James the Steward is another one who was supposed to come and throw himself on Edward's mercy, but that is changed eventually. But William Wallace has to throw himself on
He's
Edward's
public enemy
mercy.
#1.
Well, yes, he is. But at the same time...
I think in Edward's eyes, he certainly is. There can be no forgiveness for William Wallace.
But I don't know if it was more that he wanted Wallace on his knees. He
Yeah.
wanted Wallace to say, yes, I was wrong, you are the rightful ruler of Scotland.
That
which,
was
of course,
never going to happen.
Wallace is not going to do. They're very
No.
similar in that respect. So that's what Edward demanded. And of course, the Scottish nobility, he's expendable.
Yes.
You know, so, you know, if there was to be somebody thrown at
Yes.
Edward, who's very magnanimous in these, you have to understand that Edward is magnanimous as far as it goes, in that the Scots were going to get life and limb. They were not going to have any bits cut off. They weren't going to be executed, and they would get their lands back.
Yes, but I think, I mean, you know, in terms of the overall settlement, you can see that Edward learns the lesson of
Yes,
1296
definitely.
and tries to set up a regime which is less nakedly colonial in its kind
Yes.
of approach, and brings Scots on board, all of that. But I think I would set limits on the magnanimity of Edward I, and certainly a limit was Wallace. You know, and the treatment that is meted out to Wallace, I think, is particularly
Hold on,
vindictive.
we've not caught him yet.
I know. Well, we're assuming that he's not been caught, you know. So we have to kind of immediately reverse upon that. So let's catch him.
Well, let's talk about how was he caught then? How?
Well, initially,
I heard he was in Rob Royston,
well,
going at the Liddles.
Before that,
and
going in the Liddles, yeah. Well, I'm sure there's a very good. Rob Royston's a weird one. But first of all, he's with Sir Simon Fraser, and he's chased by none other than Robert Bruce, among others.
Robert the Bruce.
Yes.
So it is like Braveheart.
Yes, a few couple of late. It wasn't after Falkirk. I mean, what you have to remember is that the Scottish nobility. Edward becomes less magnanimous as time passes, probably because he's very, very sick and really, and you know, he's at the end of his tether. He becomes
He's fed up with the Scots, so he just cannot bring over to his side.
So he says to the Scottish nobility, I am watching you, you have to capture Wallace. I want him, and I'm looking at you to make sure that you act accordingly. So they're all sent out to find him. And initially, towards the end of 1304, when Simon Fraser's come to Edward's peace, so he's in, so Wallace is on his own. He's at Dundee, or just near Dundee. And I think that what he's trying to do is get out of the country. That is what he's doing. Because we know this, because when he's captured, he has his private archive. And I don't know about you, Martin, but if I was on the run, I wouldn't take my library with me, all my documentation. You know, I might take a few things, but no.
I don't know. I mean,
he has the safe conducts that he got on the continent. So he's trying to get out. Dundee would make sense, it's a port. And then the next time we see him is in Rob Royston.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably take a different line in this. Just my reading of Wallace as a character. You know, I don't think the idea that, you know, had he not been captured, he would have left. It just doesn't work for me, you know. I think unless
he's such a determined.
Unless he were continuing some diplomatic activity or whatever. But I think that Wallace, he's all about, you know, his whole life is all about, I will serve this cause.
Death or glory.
But you can't
I don't know if you
dead.
just kind of put it in those terms, but I think if he's here and he's alive, then he would just continue to serve the cause, and he does have this following, and he is still able to kind of carry out bits of military activity against the English regime. I think Wallace will go down with that ship. You know, that's the nature of the man.
Oh, I
Absolutely
don't think so. I absolutely see him leaving the country, because you don't take all those safe conducts with you.
You might have those with you anyway, I think. You know,
But
you might do so. Are these going to sort of take?
He's in Dundee, which is a port.
That doesn't mean he's going to leave, you know.
So why has he got the? See, I'm starting to take sides here. Why has he got the safe conducts if he's not going anywhere?
I know. Why would you?
Do you know what I mean?
But why not? Why not have these with you anyway? I don't know if there's a kind of reason that says, you know, I've got to have these for me, and that means I'm going to. Well, but that doesn't imply that I'm going to leave the country.
He's a marked man. He knows this. He knows he's a marked man. There's nobody. Everybody's looking for him. Everybody.
I don't know if everybody is. You know, I mean, the settlement is February of 1304. This is August now of 1305 that we're talking about. I mean, that's a pretty long time for Wallace to be able to remain, a free man and continuing active in the cause, that does not necessarily suggest to me that everybody in Scotland is seeking to hunt this man down.
He's not active in the cause. He's not. He's
How do
running.
we know, though, Fiona?
Because
I mean,
there's no.
Well, the sources.
military.
The sources are no sort of exact guide
he's
to
on
that.
his own.
I think he's still committed to the cause, and he can't be committed. He can't be on his own if he's still able to carry out some military actions.
But what military actions?
Well, there's the one at Lindores, for example. When he's kind of carries out an attack on the English there.
Is that then?
That is, yes.
Which
That's
way?
still in that period.
1304. There's no reference to Wallace between Dundee and Rob Royston.
When's Dundee?
September 1304.
September 1304. That might be the same one. Yeah. I mean,
he's on the run.
That does not mean that he's still not active in the cause.
Is it
what can he do?
Can I try? Can I try and in emotion? So maybe if what Fiona's saying is that there's continuing stronger pressure on him, that the nobility are being. Do you know what I mean? He's had that period from September.
I don't know what the evidence is for the strong pressure from the nobility. That's sort of coming down upon him. I don't know what the evidence is that Bruce, for example, is pursuing him in this period.
Because Edward thanks Bruce at Hoplew, which is Simon Fraser's lands in Selkirkshire. Wallace and Fraser are chased off by a party of horsemen that includes Robert Bruce. So, the Scots are told. Edward tells them it's most distasteful, but Edward says, hand him over, I'm watching you.
Well, I think the length of time that it takes kind of sort of suggests a different story.
He may well have had some support
underneath
the nobility, but he's a marked man. It's only a matter of time.
All right.
So I would agree on that score that if Wallace remains in the country, and to my mind Wallace is going to remain in the country, that there will come a time when it's likely that he's going to get captured. But let's assume he doesn't.
Okay.
He's not.
So whether he remains, so there's two possibilities. One is he remains in the country and avoids capture, and the second is he avoids capture by leaving the country. Okay. In each of these two scenarios, how does that change things? Now, I'm loving this debate, but just before I let you hear our two experts answer that question, since we've been talking about Robert the Bruce, let me remind you that you could put these very questions to his descendant. You see, in spring 2025, I'll be taking a group of 25 people on a fantastic 11-day tour, and as well as visiting the Isle of Skye, Hadrian's Wall, Roslin Chapel, battlefields and castles, we'll visit where Lord Bruce is home, where he'll regale you with stories from his family's history. There will also be a live comedy show in the middle of the tour and a ceilidh to end it all. In autumn, we'll be doing a different tour. Now, it'll still be 11 days, it'll still be full board bed and breakfast, but with trips to Iona, Fingal's Cave, Loch Lomond, Culloden, St Andrews, the Royal Mile and more. And yes, there'll be comedy and ceilidh included in that one as well. Click the link top right or email alexis@scotlandhistorytours.co.uk. Now, the question is, if Wallace stays or escapes to the continent, how does that change history?
Well, perhaps I would speak first of all to Wallace not being captured and remaining in the country. I really wonder whether this, at this point in time, would make a great deal of difference to the kind of overall picture, I would have to say, because I think, somewhere that Fiona and I might come together is that the last few years, of Wallace's career are ones in which he has become much more politically marginalised. To me, it's a mark of the man that he, despite that, remains dedicated to the cause.
Absolutely.
Kind of coming and serving under others, etc., etc. He will continue to do that. But as a kind of frontline commander, that had really ended at Falkirk, and then there's the diplomatic activity thereafter. So I think the reality is that, in terms of the macro political picture, Wallace now is not really significant. Where Wallace's future significance will lie is more in terms of his mythic status, his symbolic importance, and that's where Edward's treatment of him in terms of the execution, if we accept that, forgetting for a minute that Wallace has escaped that, that is maybe a significant error.
But there is an interesting question in itself, that was Wallace more valuable to the cause of independence, having been martyred, than if...
No, see, I disagree with Martin on this.
All right,
I don't think it makes any
I've
difference.
not spoken yet.
We're going like this.
But she was going to
Give me a minute.
anyway.
I think so.
I think that Wallace's significance, Wallace comes to embody the everyman of the Wars of Independence, the Superman of the Wars of Independence, and certainly when it comes to Blind Harry, what Harry does is, yes, take some of the stories about Wallace, but then take stories from everywhere in Scotland about the Wars of Independence and wrap them up in Wallace. But see, the problem I have about saying that Wallace is immediately significant as a martyr is because of Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce is not remotely interested in William Wallace.
I would disagree on that. I'll come back. I don't know.
In the sense that Wallace, Bruce is consistently about a Bruce kingship. Every step that Robert Bruce makes is to get that throne. And if you can work with Wallace, fine. If Wallace, see the big question there then, and I'm not sure of the answer to this, there's no doubt that Wallace wanted King John back. And I sense that wasn't just because any alternative was opening a can of worms that Scotland couldn't survive, if you want a civil war as well. And Wallace was not interested in that. I don't think he was interested in noble politics. John was the king. John is the king.
And he wasn't the kind of guy that was going to make a compromise in order to
In what sense?
To get peace. Well, he's not. I'm thinking about modern day politicking, where I tell you what, you have that and I have that. And,
No,
do you know what I mean?
wasn't from
The
that
horse
background.
trading. He's not that kind of guy, is he?
Well, Wallace is above that, and this is what really distinguishes him from kind of everyone else on the scene, in this point in time. But I would make a kind of different, take a different reading of this compared to Fiona. And I don't see the distance between Wallace and Bruce that perhaps Fiona does. And, I would take us back to the kind of southwestern nexus, Carrick, Ayr, Renfrewshire, that kind of world, and the kind of place in which the Wallaces were naturally aligned with the Stuarts and the Bruces and the Bishopric of Glasgow in the person of the great patriot Robert Wishart as well. And there's quite a lot of evidence for the way in which all of these elements align. And I think that, to my mind, this period, one thing that strikes me is that you see certain key personnel making that switch from Balliol to Bruce. The likes of Robert Wishart, the likes of William Lamberton, Bishop of St Andrews as well. And I would see Wallace in there as well. I think you've got a kind of nucleus of key individuals here. And I think that they are all very much on the same page. I think that
the locus of power is shifting.
Yes, I think so. And I think that Wallace would have been part of that shift as well. Because I think the bald fact is that we have to come back to here is that John Balliol, despite the fact that he's now in his ancestral estates in Picardy, had never shown the slightest bit of interest in trying to recover the kingship of the Scots. So I think people say, well, if that's the case, we need to think about a different route here. And that's where Bruce comes along. I think that Wallace would have aligned himself with Bruce and would have joined the Bruce Revolution.
And
I think that's entirely possible, because Balliol, but of course we need to make sure we're at the right point in time. When Wallace went to the continent, he went with Balliol men. They weren't John Comyn's men, they were Balliol men, and some of them were caught spying near Bordeaux. He went to see Balliol. He did not want to get involved with noble politics, which would include what Bruce was doing, which was muddying the waters with his own ambitions. But and everyone probably in 1301 to 2 were thinking that the French might intervene in the Scottish Wars for Balliol, bringing King John back. That's why Robert Bruce himself submitted to Edward I, and that's a whole other can of worms. So, but as I say, Wallace isn't remotely interested in that side of things. But I think it is entirely possible that once Balliol had resigned his claims to Scotland to King Philip, which was after this, this was after that point. If Bruce was the only alternative, I agree with you that it is not impossible that Wallace would have.
If Wallace has survived and never been caught, and John Balliol has gone, I tell you what, I'm going into a happy retirement.
The game's a bogey. I'm just going to stay in Picardy.
Then you've got Wallace and Bruce together, and what would that have done? And it's on these moments that history turns, isn't it? Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed that conversation, and if you have, here's the question: what would have happened if Wallace had never got to this stage but he'd won at the Battle of Falkirk in the first place? There's a question that needs answered, and it just so happens we've got another video where these two wonderful people have discussed that, and if you want to see that, then you need to click the video coming up on screen now. Support the channel by becoming a Patreon member. You can click top right to do that, or buy me a coffee in the description below. In the meantime, Hammy and Dachas can be Lam Alai. Cheery and Drasta.